Guys, so welcome back to the part 6 of the full stack web development course. So today is actually going to be the introduction to CSS. And in the previous video, I actually gave you a little bit of a taste of how CSS actually looked like. Alright, so today we are actually going to write some CSS of our own. So before we actually start writing CSS, I want you guys to know that you can actually write your CSS in 3 ways. Alright. And you can choose how to write your CSS in your own projects, but there is only one way which is conventionally correct. But obviously you always need to know how to write CSS in all the ways, because there might be some situations where you need to use those ways. So the ways in which you can specify your CSS are basically inline, internal and external. So first, let's go through inline CSS. So currently I've specified one h1 tag and one p tag. Alright, so we have a heading and we have a paragraph. Alright, so now how to style these with inline CSS. Alright, so as you guys know that every HTML tag has some attributes. Alright, so one attribute that every HTML tag has, it's called style. So we can just simply write style, which is an attribute of any HTML tag that you work with. And in that style, you can actually specify your CSS. Alright, so here we are actually specifying the color. Alright, so the color of the tag, that is the color of the heading. So what color the heading would be when it appears on your viewport. Alright, so here we have actually specified the color as red. Alright, and this is the structure of how you write CSS. Alright, so first things first, you specify what property you actually want to target, and there are n number of properties in CSS, and you actually need to know quite some of them in order to style your websites accordingly. So here we are actually targeting the color property of the h1 tag. So once you write the property that you want to target, you actually apply a colon, and after that you specify what you want to assign that property with. Alright, so here we actually want to assign color with red. Alright, so this would make our heading turn red on our viewport. And this is how you write inline CSS. And as the name specifies, it's inline. That is, it's in the line in which you are actually writing the HTML. So before we actually move on to the viewport, let's also style our paragraph tag. Alright, so now I've actually styled my paragraph tag. And as you can see, not only have I actually given it a color, I've also specified a border for it. So in CSS, you actually end every property with a semicolon, just like in some of the programming languages. So you actually need to end every single CSS property with a semicolon. Alright, and there are some liberties that are actually given to you by CSS, because as you can obviously see that we have no semicolon when we specified the color red, and we have no semicolon when we specified our border. But there is no one stopping us from actually writing the semicolon there, which is actually conventionally correct. So we are actually going to add the semicolon after every CSS tag. Alright, so we are actually going to specify the semicolon after specifying the color red and also after specifying the border. Alright, so once you are actually happy with your CSS, you can actually save that and go ahead onto your viewport after going live. So as you can currently see on my viewport, the CodeCove is actually appearing in red. That was our heading. And the paragraph is actually appearing in purple with a green border. And all this was actually specified with the help of our inline CSS. Alright, so now that we know how to use inline CSS, now let's go ahead and check out what is internal CSS. So inside of our head tag, we can actually specify another tag which is called style. So as you can see that I have actually created a new tag style, which is obviously a predefined tag in HTML, which you can actually specify inside of your head, under which you can actually write your whole CSS. So currently we were writing inline CSS, but now we are actually going to write internal CSS. And by that I mean the CSS which is actually inside your HTML. So the way in which you are actually going to write CSS now is actually going to be a little bit different than the inline CSS. Alright. Because in the style tag, you actually need to specify what tag you are actually targeting. So let me give you an example of what do I mean by that. Alright, so as you can see that I've actually specified h1 and opened my curly brackets, and inside that I've actually written my CSS. Alright, so this is how you actually write CSS. You actually target the tag that you want to actually style and then specify the properties that you want to alter. Alright. So here we are actually targeting the h1 tag. Alright, so this is actually going to target every h1 tag that's inside your HTML. and it would actually give every h1 tag in your HTML a blue color. All right, so let's actually go ahead and specify another heading just under our paragraph. All right, and this would actually be chilling at the Cove. All right, so now let's go ahead onto a viewport and check out how our h1 tag is actually looking like. All right, so now as you can see that chilling at the Cove is actually appearing in blue. But you might ask that you just told us that it would actually target every h1 tag, and CodeCove was also an h1 tag. So why didn't that turn blue? Well, every other CSS, that is internal, external, and inline, have different precedence. That means that inline CSS actually has the highest precedence of them all. Alright, so if you actually have some inline CSS written for a specific tag, it would have the highest precedence. Alright, that means that only that CSS would actually get reflected. But if we actually go ahead and define another property for our h1 tag, let's say a border. So now I've actually specified a border for every h1 tag in my HTML. So now if you actually look at a viewport, it actually gets reflected for every h1. So inline CSS written for that specific property would have highest precedence. All right. So here actually we have specified the inline CSS for the color of our h1 tag. And as we only have specified the color, so only the color will have the highest precedence for h1, for this specific h1 for which we have written inline CSS. So it's actually going to override the internal CSS with the inline CSS for this specific h1 tag. And for all the other h1 tags, it's actually going to work as normal. All right. So this is the difference between inline and internal CSS. So now that we have styled our h1 tag with the help of internal CSS, now let's look at how we can also style our paragraph tag inside this style tag itself. So you can actually specify the paragraph tag with p, open another curly braces, and inside that you can specify its own CSS. Alright, so why not specify a background color for our paragraph? Alright, so here I've actually specified the background color as aqua. And now if you look at our viewport, it's actually going to get reflected because we are not overwriting the background color in our inline CSS. All right. And if we were actually to go ahead and write something as color or a border in here with the p tag, it's actually going to get overridden by the inline CSS. All right. So I hope you guys now have a good understanding of what inline and internal CSS are. And in the real world environment, this style tag is almost never used, and inline CSS is actually used in places where you actually need to override one specific tag. All right, so let's say that you had some multiple headings on your website and you actually have created a CSS somewhat like this. All right, so let's say you have headings with h1 and you have this specific styling for every h1. All right. But the client has requested that on some other page, he wants the heading to look a little bit different. All right. So what would you do in that case? So in that case, inline CSS comes into play. All right. So you would actually go ahead and actually alter some of the properties in the inline CSS in order to make the heading look a little bit different according to what the needs of your client are. All right. So the role of inline and internal CSS vary according to situation. And to be ready for each situation, you need to know how to write CSS in all the three types. Alright, so now we know inline and internal CSS. So what's external CSS? So external CSS is actually the CSS that I showed you in the previous video. Alright, in which you actually have an external CSS style sheet. Alright, a full style sheet dedicated to CSS. Alright, and that CSS you can actually import with the help of the link tag. Alright, which I have already done for my HTML. Alright, so I've actually written linked, and the relationship is actually going to be style sheet, and the href is actually going to be part6.css. That's the name that I gave my CSS. Alright, and this is actually going to be known as external CSS. This is the CSS that is going to be used 99% of the time. Alright, and good news is that you don't write this CSS any different than we have written it inside of our style tag. All right. So if we actually copy this whole thing and paste it inside of our CSS, well, that's how you write CSS externally. All right. So it's just a style tag which is actually getting imported from an external script. That's all that it is. All right. So that's why no one actually writes CSS inside of the style tag. All right. Better to export it from an external script. All right. So now let's go ahead and alter some of the properties inside of our external CSS. So as you can see that I've actually altered the colors for h1, and the same goes for the background color of our paragraph. All right. So now let's look at what our HTML actually looks like, because now we have all the three types of CSS linked to our HTML. All right. So now if we go ahead look onto our viewport, nothing has actually changed. Now why is that? Now if you actually remember the precedence, all right. So the highest precedence is of the inline CSS, then comes the style tag, and then comes your external CSS. All right. So as all of these properties are getting overridden by all the other types of our CSS, that is the style tag and the inline CSS. So as you can see that the h1 color is actually getting overridden twice. All right. So once by the style tag, that is blue, and the other by the inline CSS, that is red. And ultimately it's actually getting shown as red. And as you can see that we actually specified the border as yellow here. But in the style tag, it's actually getting overridden by the blue. And the same goes for the background of our paragraph. All right, so now you know that what precedence each CSS has with respect to another. All right, so and this you actually need to know, because you might fall into some situations where you need to use this precedence for your own good. All right, because it would make your life much easier. All right, so now that you actually won't be seeing this style tag, I guess never ever again in your life. So I'm just going to delete this, because we are actually not going to be using this style tag because it's very unconventional. So now that we have gotten rid of the style tag, now let's go ahead and check out our viewport. Now our external CSS is actually getting reflected. All right. So now you can see that the border has turned yellow and the background of a paragraph has actually turned pink, or whatever this color is, because I cannot pronounce that. It's pale violet red, I guess. Yeah, it's pale violet red. So yeah, so now our external CSS is actually getting reflected. So now let's go ahead and understand what our border actually looked like. All right. So the border is actually specified a little bit differently. You would think that you would just specify border yellow, but that's not what I actually did. So the border here is actually specified as 2 pixels solid yellow. All right. So by 2 pixel, it means that the border would actually be 2 pixel thick. Solid means that it would have no gaps. It would be a continuous solid border, and the color would actually be yellow. So in CSS, some properties actually have more input values that you can actually provide them. So you can actually provide different kinds of input value to get a different result. All right, so if I actually change the input value for the pixel, that is the width of the border, to actually, let's say 10, and go ahead and look at my viewport, the border is actually going to be 10 pixel thick. And as you can see that the border is actually now 10 pixels thick and in the color of yellow. So that's how you actually alter CSS, and with time you are actually going to get the hang of it and get used to it, and then you would actually be able to work with any type of CSS that's actually thrown at you. For now, you only need to know in what ways you can actually specify your CSS. That was inline, internal, and external. Now I would let you go ahead and play with the precedences of each of those, and in the next one we are actually going to go through IDs and classes. All right, and as you can see that I've actually specified some IDs and classes over here. All right, so in the next one we are actually going to go through how to specify IDs and classes for each HTML tag and what they actually stand for, and how they are actually going to help us in writing our CSS. So all that we are actually going to do in the next one. So until then, keep chilling at the CodeCove.